This is the R4DS DevOps for Data Science Book Club. And today we are talking to Alex Gold, the author, about primarily about sections 2 and 3, but just generally about the book and the things that we have seen so far and our thoughts and our questions and all of that. So I posted in the channel, but just to kind of review, I looked at the pull requests that have happened while we've been reading these parts of the book. And the main changes are that chapter 3 split in half into, let's see, it was data science project components, and now is data pipeline architecture plus designing your application layers. And so that's something we might all want to go look back at. So while we have you here, Alex, like, is there a lot added, or is it more just an organizational change?
Yeah, that's a good question. Do I even remember? Yeah, I feel like trying to remember what I have changed is
fair enough.
It's easy to remember what I haven't changed at this point.
Okay.
Let me. I'm just taking a look. Let me take a look at those sections. I think at a high level, it was mostly organizational. I think it was in recognition of the fact that those chapters were very long.
That fits with my memory of it after kind of glancing at it. It's harder to compare these on GitHub since the file structures or the it's not just a changed file. I do see that it doesn't look like you have the portfolio exercises updated. Do you have plans for those, or is it still the next time you go through, you'll figure out what
So just sort of for your context, I just finished my full pass through the book last week. And so I'm about, actually the one section I haven't done is there's an appendix I need to spend some time on, but I just finished the full pass through the book. There's one change to an example to the Docker example I want to make. And then I'm going to start back at the beginning again. And so probably updating some of those portfolio exercises will go with that. I can't imagine that actually I don't think the content of those exercises is going to change at all, but they might get a little closer aligned to the content of each chapter. But I think sort of the writing might change and the organization might change, but I don't think overall the sort of scope of those exercises is going to change.
Okay, that makes sense. So that does lead to kind of my usual question of, that's the chapter 4 is now the API chapter, and you talk about making an API in Plumber, and I'm just wondering if you know of anything like in between launching it on your laptop and like Posit Connect, or I guess even like spinning it up on AWS or that sort of thing, that there are a lot of steps. Like there's a lot more involved in deploying an API than in there isn't a equivalent of free tier Shiny apps, for example. And just for people, I don't know, I'm always looking out for what can I suggest to people who are trying to learn it. And there isn't a tier, it seems like there's a missing level.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean,
okay.
I put it in the Docker chapter, right? And if you look at the Plumber API documentation, there are plenty of run a container for me kind of things, right? Like DigitalOcean, I think will do that.
Yeah.
AWS, ECS will do that. I don't know of any free options that will sort of do that for you. So I agree there is a missing layer there. And if I could wave a magic wand and make it happen, I probably would add Plumber API hosting to Shiny apps or Posit Cloud. But I think probably prioritizing the engineering work is probably not happening right now. So
that is fair. I looked at I guess it was specifically GCP, and you can run one API free. You can't actually use it, but you can have it running. That's the credits they give you. But then past that, like if you want to, play around and have a couple just running, not even getting hits, it's like $1,000, $800 a year or something like that. On their API specific, whatever it's called. I can't remember if that's Cloud Runner or whatever.
Their equivalent of Lambda.
It's yeah, like it's a little bit, it's I think higher, like less startup time the first time you call it than Lambda, but it's like Lambda. So yeah.
I mean, I think one of the things here that like is I think in a lot of places see APIs as a like, that means you're at more than like hobbyist status, which like maybe that's fair, maybe that's not fair. But I think a lot of services price it that way, where like APIs are sort of a like pro level feature that if you want to actually host and use APIs, you're at like more than just being a hobbyist, which may be fair, maybe not fair, but
Yeah, I think the reason that I like am obsessed with it is like I think that you could get more people up to the pro level if you let them play. And it's hard to play.
I actually I completely agree. That actually I think there really is a missing layer to promote adoption of APIs for data science. I completely agree. So for what it's worth, I agree with you. I don't have a good solution, but I do agree.
All right. Well, that is good to know. At least every time I'm like, am I just missing something? But no. The world is.
I know. Yeah. As far as I know, you are not missing. There being a sort of right, like, I've like talked to Joe Chang about this, about like, should Shiny Server also host a Plumber API? Like, should you be able to host a Plumber API on Shiny Server? I think it's a great idea, but again, prioritizing the engineering work to do that is hard with all the other priorities that are around.
Yeah, it is funny because it is like Shiny can run an API, like it has all the tooling in there that you could set up an API, and so I've thought about like trying to, I don't know, streamline that process. And
could you?
Okay. Yeah, because you can
I was about to ask, how would that work?
HTTP response in Shiny. You can send any response.
Oh yeah, I know. Joe has a gist somewhere of something like that, right? But it's really pretty hacky, if I recall.
It is, but so I've always wondered, or not wondered, but I've contemplated just like putting a wrapper around the hackiness to make it work.
Yeah.
But it feels like that's not what's intended on Shiny apps. So I don't know. Anyway, I just wish that were easier, because I want to start like giving myself the discipline on R4DS stuff, and like using that to learn, and then to encourage to do it in other contexts. And I have I'm working for a company right now that has Posit Connect, and so like that's the other end of the spectrum. But
it's like it's super great, but it costs some money.
Yeah, and it's not something you can, as a hobbyist, kind of get comfortable with. So.
Yeah. The one option is Posit Cloud is going to, I can't remember whether it's out yet or it's coming soon, right? But Posit Cloud will enable hosting of, I know we're doing apps. Are we doing APIs also? And so it's possible that hosting it on Posit Cloud will be, if not free, at least a lot cheaper than like $1,000 a year. But I have to recall whether, I know we're doing all of the like Shiny and Dash and Streamlit. I can't remember if we're doing APIs as well. I have to look at that.
Okay. Well, that's an interesting thing to watch then. That was my main question before we kind of start talking about what you're looking for. To Tinashe and Gus, do you have anything you wanted to bring up?
Not really.
Yeah, not specifically.
Okay. Oh, go ahead.
What you and Alex were just talking about like bridging the hobbyist to like real time gap where like this is cool. I can set it all up at home, but I haven't run into the issues that I probably would in the real world, so to speak.
Yes. And I don't know, you don't have the encouragement to like really work on the security side of things if it's all just running on your laptop, so there's no way for anyone to get to it.
Also, it's the security side of things, so it's only going to be as secure as I know how to break into it.
Yeah. So I guess the other things that I saw that had changed, mostly a lot of the work has been in that section 4 that we're about to start. So that's helpful that it didn't change under us. There was a lot of work in chapter 5, logging and monitoring. It looked like mostly it was like deleting. It looks like you streamlined it quite a bit, which is nice.
Yeah.
And then in chapter 10, the getting started with the cloud, you rewrote the lab. I think it's effectively the same content, just a little.
Yeah, I did a lot of, I mean, I
stepwise.
did a ton of rewriting throughout that section. The content changed very little. The organization and the writing changed a lot. But I have not, the logging and monitoring chapter, I did add a fair bit of like I streamlined a lot of the logging content and added a lot more depth on monitoring because
Okay.
it was that was a very like glossy take on it before, and it's a little more detailed now at least. But the stuff, you know, that what's now section 3, right? Basically on like putting up your own AWS server and all of that. I did a ton of reorganizing, a ton of rewriting, but mostly just for like clarity. The content is very, very like that's changed actually very little, especially given the amount of work that I put into it. Like the content is basically the same. Hopefully it's a lot easier to read than it was, you know, when you all started in it. So sorry.
Well, for the most part, we were like just behind you on those.
Yeah.
So I think
Okay, great.
we mostly got to take advantage of the changes. Chapter 10, we read just before the big reorg. We read it when it was 8 or whatever it was.
Yeah.
And then we went back. That's
Yeah.
the getting started with the cloud.
Okay, oh, you got it. Yeah. Yeah, because I
and
moved that
then,
one around, I think, right?
Yeah, and you added the IT admin tools section.
Right. Pull a lot of that out of those sections and put it into its own section.
Yeah. And so then we went back and read those.
Went through almost that. There was very little changes to that. It was just extracting it into a standalone section.
Yes. Well, you know, like I say, luckily it was like right when we were getting to things. And so that when we went back and read it, and then by the time we read those, you had done the AWS section. So
cool.
Worked out pretty well.
Great. I'm glad that happened. I've been very cognizant of feeling bad that I was like moving things around from under you, but I'm glad that it didn't affect you all too much as you were reading.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, we know what we got into when we started reading this book while you're still actively working on it. So that is totally okay. And from everything I've seen, like I really like the reorg in 10, the way you did the lab, that it's much more just, you know, here are the steps to make this work.
Yeah.
So
that was definitely a lot of the work I was doing in terms of the writing was like taking most of the sort of understanding stuff into the body of the text and really making the lab that sort of like step by step, just like here's the stuff you do. Was definitely the intent there.
That's super useful, because the first time it's scary.
Yeah.
And so like getting the step-by-step guide is
cool.
Very helpful. And so I like that. So I guess the next thing I would like to know is, are there any questions you have for us, especially about, I guess, the first 3 sections Yeah, and I'll leave it open to whatever you might want to know.
Yeah, I mean, I think at a high level, I'm just really curious, like, how useful is this, right? Like, is this kind of thing where you're reading, you're like, this is really useful? It's sort of like, yeah, this is interesting, but like, whatever. Are there, are there questions it's not really answering for you? Are there things it's sort of not quite getting to? Does it feel like it goes far enough? Are there big pieces where you're like, yeah, that anyway, I'm just sort of generally curious about sort of like, is whatever itch you were hoping to get scratched by reading, right? Is it scratching it?
For me, I would say so far it is. I like this section 3 has been just really useful to break it down. There were pieces of this that like I had administered our like data science working servers at my old job and didn't know how to do half of these things here. And like, I had that situation of, yeah, we have a DevOps team, but they're busy with the software, and the data science team, oh, whatever, you guys figure it out. So,
yeah.
And some of the things, it was like, oh, that thing I couldn't get help with, it's not that hard. Once you know what the terminology is and that kind of thing. So
yeah,
I found that really helpful.
Hear.
Yeah,
that's good. I mean, that's certainly the persona. I was in exactly the same spot a few jobs ago where like I ended up administering our RStudio server instance, and had no idea what I was doing, and like cobbled together, things I learned from online. And if I'd had this book, I think like I at least would have known what to Google a lot better than I knew what to Google back then. And so that's really been what I've had in mind. So I'm glad to hear that it feels like if you'd had it in that role, it would have been very helpful, because that is kind of the persona I've been primarily thinking about.
Good. Yeah, it is. It was like really scratching that itch, for sure. So, and then like the section 1, it's been a while since we read those, but I've been harping on this. I want an easier way to play with APIs thing, because I like bought into your advice. Oh yeah, I really should be like subdividing things more, except like I can't, some of the things I can serve it off of like a cheap AWS, EC2 or Lambda, depending on what it is. But it's pretty heavy lift, or pretty, a heavy lift for some of those things.
The other piece, right, which is that is that like even the APIs we're setting up here don't have authentication in front of them, and so you do run the risk of like, somebody just sort of spamming your API and that sort of thing. And so that's only the part of it that I'm like, I feel pretty comfortable teaching people how to like put up a Jupyter Hub or a RStudio server, and it's it's behind SSL, like it's reasonably secure. But a API without authentication is like a bit of a liability. And so the ways to put authentication in front of a bare API are like, they're not a trivial amount of work. And I don't really want to like go off on that tangent. So I'm not quite sure what to do there. Because I am sort of the opinion that like putting an API behind authentication is like not hobbyist level stuff,
right?
Like that's sort of an indication that you're like in the big leagues and should be working with professional admins.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like what you talk about in the early on in the book, part of the introduction. You mentioned that part of the goal here isn't to make you an IT professional. It's to make sure that you know what you're talking about when you need to talk to an IT professional.
Right.
Yeah. So I think it does a very good job of hitting that niche.
Cool.
I think one thing that I super appreciate is that I'm coming at this from an early career perspective. And I think that having the ideas all in one place is just super valuable for anybody who is trying to break into their first or second role, or an internship or something, because it's just like before this book, it was like, I kind of know what an API is because I read that one Python blog post. And I kind of know what AC2 is because I read somebody had a blog post about using it with something else. And it's like, like having this in one place where you can walk through it and just say, this is where all of these like concepts connect is just absolutely invaluable in my opinion. And I'm going to promote this very early on in the data science like learning. When I recommend it to people, like I think I would recommend it very early on, like even after your first pass at like R4DS. Like,
cool. That's very cool to hear. I'm glad to hear that.
I'm liking the idea of having it, and I guess I've already used it this way of I need to go talk to someone about SSH. And so, or they told me I need to talk to them about SSH. I'm like, oh, okay. Let me go read this chapter on SSH to know what the heck we're going to talk about, or that kind of thing. That things that if you are new to the idea of a lot of these things, you might not know the terminology, and so being able to go in there a little bit prepared to whoever you're going to be talking to, or if I don't know, sometimes like someone will throw some jargon at you, and you're like, what? Oh, okay, that's just this. I get it. So having all these things, I think, is going to prove really useful.
That's great. I mean, so that's great to hear, because I think that is sort of like the central use case I've been envisioning for this book, right? Is like, I'm early, maybe early in my data science career or later on, and I've done a lot of the data science part, but now I'm trying to like be more into the other parts. So that's great. Like that's I mean, that's very, very happy feedback for me to hear that like it's meeting the sort of central idea I had about it. I'm really curious if there are pieces it's not meeting where you're like, well, like I think one very fair criticism you could make of this book is that like really what I need to know a lot more about is about like databases and data engineering, and you don't really say a lot about that. Or like other, like are there things that you're like, I really wish there was a chapter on blah, or I really wish that you like would spend more time on ABC that would sort of like that, like, this is all nice. It's good background knowledge. It's helpful to unpack some jargon, but like what I really need to know this week is not in here. Is there anything that's sort of falling into that category?
At least for me, like where I'm at now, we'll make a project, we do it, we wrap it up, like it works great, and then it gets sent off to IT, and we essentially never see it again. And so like, if I know that there's a DevOps team who will be trying to implement my work, how can I structure it? Essentially, how am I structuring it to help them? Whereas like here, like I know the big picture. In that situation, I know my part, and I don't really know what they're going to do with it or how they're going to implement it.
And are they like re-implementing it in another language, or what? Do you have any idea what they're doing? That's interesting.
It depends.
Really call that an anti-pattern and be like, don't do that. It would kind of be my
depends.
my reaction to that, but
I try and write like complete, for lack of a better term, like complete code. Whereas sometimes people will just send like SQL statements and be like, these need to get linked together. Or I think the absolute worst we've done is just like a text description of what something needs to do. But as we're trying to sort of branch out into more complicated things that can't just be represented by SQL statements, it would need a massive organizational change for us to be able to implement and run these things ourselves. And so how can we make these kinds of DevOps changes on our end in a way that works with whatever upstream process is going on?
Yeah, this is where my day job comes in, and I'm like, yeah, go buy Posits Pro products, because that's like that's the bridge. I mean, and again, right? Like your organization can do what's going to do, but
that's a really hard situation, right? Because like you're kind of stuck between like an IT team that's like, we own all the stuff, but like, you know way better than they do what needs to happen. And I know that kind of IT data science like relationship, and I've never come up with a brilliant way to make it work super well. I think it tends to be problematic, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, I agree with your day job sentiments.
Well, and just, you know, I'm not here to pitch you on Posit's Pro products, but like
our
basic thesis there is like, you know, let's take the IT admin-y stuff and make it like so that the IT admin group can feel comfortable that the data scientists can sort of do what they need to do, but like keep them in a sort of box of acceptable things for them to do, right? And that's sort of the philosophy of the professional products. And so that tends to work better for those kinds of organizations where the IT group is really like, no, like you don't get to have control over any of this, right? We control it, but you still need a way to like write code that's good and get it into production. That's a hard, to me, that's a very, very hard thing to fix with sort of purely open source, you know, kind of solutions, just because of the sort of nature of those IT groups, which is unfortunate.
I definitely think like being able to talk to them is going to be just a really big helpful thing. So I think that this is going to be really useful in that regard. So I guess the next thing that I'm curious about is we're going into this final section. Like what, I guess, can you give us a preview, and then like what sorts of things would you like us to kind of watch out for to let you know?
Yeah, I mean, so this final section really is about undoing everything in section 3, right? So it's like we did all the stuff in section 3 to like sort of set up your little hobbyist environment, and that's cool. And then section 4 is all about undermining that and pointing out like, here's why this doesn't work in an enterprise context. Here's where this starts to fall apart when you're really operating at scale. And so like, you know, to me that there are sort of, right, like and like, I don't think I'm going to say this in the book because it doesn't sort of feel like the right way to say it, but like sort of the section 4 section to me is like for people who have Posits Pro products or really need it. And this is like my day job is we spend a ton of time working with people who have our Pro products and still have all these problems talking to their IT group. And so that section is really about like, okay, you have a supported product, you have Posit Connect, you have a Plotly Dash Pro or whatever they call it, right? Their thing. You know, you have some formally supported thing, but these problems about communicating with IT don't go away. In fact, they actually get right, Gus, to your point, right? Like they sort of get more severe in some ways when IT becomes more formal and bigger. And so section 4 is really about trying to pull apart the concerns of enterprise level IT groups, help you understand them, and help you understand how to communicate with them about the data science specific things that come up around sort of the interface between like data science and enterprise level IT, because that's mostly what my day job is helping with sort of that translation layer and that like that communication. And so that's really the goal of section 4 is like, okay, you set up your hobbyist environment, like that's awesome. You have now a pretty good like fundamental understanding of what's going on. But now if you have an IT admin group that like is, you know, running this stuff for you in some manner, they're going to have concerns that like the standalone EC2 instance you set up is just not going to get near. And hopefully if you understand their concerns better and understand like what some solutions might be, it'll make it easier to get what you need from them at the end of the day. So that's sort of the basic idea of section 4. And so I think, what is it? It's four chapters, one on sort of like how enterprise IT thinks about managing servers and how it's very different than like, I'm just going to go set up an EC2 instance, networking and how it gets much more complicated in enterprise, authentication and authorization and how that is a very hard problem. And scaling, right? How they sort of, how you think about like scaling and load balancing and those kinds of concerns that come up when you have like an IT group running your thing and they have an SLA that they have to meet and sort of those kinds of concerns that again are not the concerns of you running your own thing for yourself or for yourself and 3 teammates, but when you have 500 people on a POSIT workbench instance, downtime gets much more costly and you start to hit a lot of different kinds of concerns. So that's sort of the whole idea of section 4.
Cool. So are there any questions you have or I guess sometimes you've been noting it in the book. I don't know if you stuck with that.
I've removed a lot of that because a lot of those questions were like narrow questions about the writing. I think the biggest question for me about section 4 is it is very conceptual because the idea is like, you should not go and do this yourself, right? This is the don't DIY it chapter. And so it's very conceptual. There's no like hands-on labs or anything. And so I'm sort of curious the degree to which this is useful, the degree to which it feels a little too just like, you're just talking at me. Or if it's like, oh, this is helpful. Like I've heard my IT admin talk about high availability. This helps me understand like, oh, what the heck are they actually talking about when they talk about that? So, I think really just the same question of sort of like, is this useful? and how do you see it being useful to you is sort of at the end of the day, my question here.
Yeah, so one of the reasons I am invested in the next chapter is a personal experience at an old institution, where we were trying to do some pretty hardcore high level data science, but it being a large university, obviously their IT department is enormous and they think that they've provided everybody with everything that they need. And there's a lot of rigidity around that because of the lag in a communal understanding between like people who have been doing IT since IT was invented and like scientists who are dum-dums who only started using computers 10 years ago. So I am personally invested in being able to have conversations with IT where it's not just like, hey, I need RStudio. And then they say, yeah, you can just use X11 forwarding. And I'm like, that doesn't work.
Yeah. So I'll be really curious for your feedback on like, does this help or did it not really hit the need here? Mm-hmm. I don't talk a lot actually in this section about the horrible, I'm just going to host a remote desktop for you situation, which a lot of IT organizations go for. But I honestly don't have to say about that other than it sucks. And I'm sorry if you find yourself in that situation and you should try and convince your IT team that it is bad.
Yeah. And at least if we have the jargon to communicate with them, it's like, we can meet somewhere halfway a little bit less painful.
Yeah. And like having some more picture of why they have concerns that might seem weird to us. So that's what I'm hoping to see here. I mean, I don't know. At this point, I don't know that there's a lot left that I don't understand what their concerns are, but maybe. So it'll be interesting to see.
Alex, I kind of feel bad because I feel like my entire experience right now is read the book and then do exactly what Alex says not to do. But I have no control over it. But I guess again, it depends on who your audience is. And so a lot of the earlier chapters are really good about here's how you can do this for yourself. But some of the later things get a little bit trickier in that regard. And I don't know if there's a way to be like, oh, here's a cool thing you could do. You might not want to set up a whole EC2 instance for yourself, but here's something similar that you might be able to do on your own.
Can you say a little more, like what So you said like you're reading the book and doing like exactly what I'm like, don't do that. What do you mean by that? Like what kind of stuff?
Well, like it's the things that I don't have control over. I would love to do these things, and that's why I joined the book club. But like trying to get set up with Docker and having like proper EC2 or Databricks instances for compute and data storage, and having like being able to set up an API to query for a bunch of stuff, or really anything, like setting up a well thought out and planned app. But like I said, if I have to just like kick it over to IT, I can't really write something with a whole lot of moving parts.
Yeah. Yep.
And so if I did want to do something for myself, maybe I'm not going at like, let's say I'm starting a business, a little small business. I'm not necessarily in the whole like EC2 realm. I have a laptop under my desk that I can turn into like a little like server or something. And how can I hit all of this in the small business environment and not necessarily like large enterprise organization?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, my depending on like the scope of what you're talking about, right? Like my hope would be that the sort of stuff in section 3 gets you to a reasonable starting place, right? Actually, and I think one of the questions I had about section 3, right, is I go through setting up RStudio server, go through setting up Jupyter Hub, go through setting up a Plumber API on a Docker container. What I don't have is like a Shiny app. Like, right, I could put Shiny server in there with either an R or a Python Shiny app. And I'm curious whether that feels like is that meaningful? Is it a miss not to have it in there? Does it feel like it's probably close enough that you could figure it out now? Just really curious for any thoughts you all have on like, like to that question of like sort of the small business case, right? Like I would see that putting up a workbench or an app server on a small EC2 instance feels like the right kind of level for that. And so like, I would totally believe if you all said like, if you showed me how to actually really put up a Shiny app, like that would actually be really helpful so that I knew how to host one for myself. It might just be a nice to have, seeing as it hasn't come up, but I am curious, like whether that feels like a miss not to have that in here, or whether even doing a Shiny app instead of a Plumber API might be a better fit.
I would like to learn about that part of Shiny, but I don't know if it might be covered elsewhere. So I don't know if like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly there's Shiny server open source, there's documentation around it. I'm unaware of any resources sort of like at the similar level of this book of like here's how you would sort of soup to nuts go host a Shiny app somewhere. There obviously are lots of like little articles that people have written about hosting a Shiny app, but not with the not integrated with the rest of the treatment in this book of like how to stand up an instance and how to put up a proxy in front of it and that sort of thing.
I mean, I certainly wouldn't mind it. I think I didn't notice it as missing largely because that's something that I have already struggled through. And so I think the pieces that you add to my understanding, I could like kind of just tack on to, oh, okay, I should do that way or things like that. But it probably would be useful to, if you can fit it, like I'm trying to think of how it would kind of fit in.
Yeah, I think, it would not be hard to just add it, right? Like adding it in section, whatever section it is where we put up, workbench or not workbench, RStudio server and Jupyter Hub and the Plumber API, like just adding Shiny server in there is probably like the equivalent of a few paragraphs worth of work. And my sense is that if it helped, like, John, I guess my question is like, if you hadn't struggled through it before, would it be useful to have been able to find it here with the rest of this stuff?
So I will say, thinking about it now, that the lab in chapter 11 is what you're talking about, and like it feels like a really great resource. So putting Shiny in there, then that lab is like the basic level of all the data science stuff. So I think that would be handy. So yeah, I could see it, in there. It's kind of there, but I don't I don't remember now. Like you have, little bits about what is different about this thing. So what's different about Plumber versus the RStudio workbench versus whatever, or RStudio server rather. So having that little bit of this is what's different about Shiny would be helpful.
Cool. The other thing that I'm trying to think about is, I really do want this book. Like there's basically nothing in here that I've written that is R specific. I am a little worried that my examples are R heavy, and Python people are going to look at this book and be like, this is not for me. Whereas I really like, other than some of the examples being R language example, like that was why I put Jupyter Hub in here, was because like, then if you're a Python person, like you have the example that you probably care more about. And so I am wondering if I should, either with the API that I'm putting in, right? So like, there's the chapter on putting an API in a Docker container, and I'm thinking about subbing out a Plumber API for like a Python fast API, or perhaps doing Shiny for Python as the Shiny app I would put in here, because Shiny server can host both Shiny for R and Shiny for Python. So maybe that's a good way to go. But just trying to think about like, how do I add more credibility on the Python side? Because I'm worried that Python people are gonna look at this book and be like, oh, this is an R book. I don't need this. Whereas I don't think there's anything in here that's particularly language specific.
Yeah, I mean, it is hard that a lot of cases it kind of doubles what you have to include. But I think on the Shiny one, like especially setting up the Shiny server, it's fairly agnostic, and I think that's a good thing about it. So I don't know. I haven't done it for Python, so I can't comment on much. And I'll say, please don't take out too much R content, because I like the R content. But I understand where you're coming from.
Yeah, I mean, the funniest part is that for me, right, like the hard part will be like writing a Python API or Shiny app, just because it's not hard, but I'm just so much more fluent in R that I may just steal like an off-the-shelf example for that, whereas writing a little app or an API in R is pretty trivial. But that to me, like that's the work I actually don't feel like doing. It's like the host, adding the part on how to host Shiny server is like no problem. It's like, oh, do I really have to write a Python API or app? That seems silly, but maybe I can draft somebody to help me with it who actually writes Python for their day job. Take them 10 minutes.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think like going back to the introduction of the book, we can think more about like what are the data science products that we expect people to generate, and we could maybe have this. I don't intend to ask you to rewrite any content of the book, but maybe some level of conversation around like, here are the data science like products that you should expect to have mastered by the time you finish this book. And saying like
that's an interesting point. Do you think that belongs in this book? Like, I guess my question, right? Like, I've tried here to stay mostly on the side of like DevOps-y stuff, but I mean, maybe a discussion about different kinds of data science products and like why you might choose to make your your thing, this product versus that kind of thing. Maybe that does belong in this book.
Yeah, so that's what I mean. It's sort of like, in the context of being a data scientist and having to communicate with the IT team or a DevOps team and being fluent here, it's like, okay, well, what exactly are you going to be talking about? You're going to be talking about these like three different categories of data science-y things that, like Gus mentioned, that you're going to hand them at some point. And one of those things could be a request for a Shiny server.
Right. Yeah, sort of the like static things, jobs,
exactly.
APIs and apps, and making sure people really understand the distinctions and why you might choose to do one or the other. And yeah, that's true. That is a discussion I have often with people at work, and it's not really in this book. I mean, that's not a hard section to write. That totally makes sense and fits with what's in here.
And I think it'll make it easier for us all and for you particularly to decide like what examples are going in this book, because
that's great feedback. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I do still have a Quarto example somewhere in here, right? In the pipeline section, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then adding an app would be appropriate, right? It would be appropriate to have a Shiny app somewhere in here.
Yeah.
Or you have that conversation and you decide that that's not something that you want to have in the book because it's just not part of the products that you want to have there.
I mean, I think giving the example of how to host Shiny server is worthwhile. I think the only question on my mind is, do I have people host Shiny server bare, or do I do it in a Docker container? And there are lots of reasons why you should not do it in a Docker container, but it's also so easy to do in a Docker container.
I think having like being able to read that conversation that you were having in your head would actually be pretty useful. So, because I don't know the answer to that, what would you recommend that we do, and why, and what are the trade-offs? So, I think that'd be great. And even if it is that you just do like you do it in the Docker container, you say it's easier to do this way, but you might want to do, not do it in real use because of yada yada yada, or or vice versa. If you do it without the container, and either way. Yeah, that's great. I am really definitely looking forward to reading this next section and finishing the book. From our perspective, which does lead to the one last question of, I can't remember if you have said before, do you have any kind of timeline on the book?
Well, my original deadline was last June. So no, actually my deadline is this. PositConf is coming up in September. And one of my colleagues is doing a workshop entitled DevOps for Data Science that is going to be at least sort of like loosely based on some of the content in this book. And so there's no way that the print copies of this book are going to be done for then, but I would like to be pretty final with I want it to be done and like heading to the printers by PositConf in September. That's really my I really want to be done by then and like going to print at that point, or very, very final stages kind of thing. So I that still seems achievable. It really does feel like I'm at the point, like this discussion today has been super helpful. There are a couple little things I'm going to go add here, but they're, on the order of a few hours of work and a few extra, a few little like mini sections. So I was like, my wife was asking me before this call, she was like, so is there anything you're scared about getting feedback? And I was like, only that it might reveal that I have a lot more work to do. This conversation is not revealing a ton of extra stuff. So that feels good and makes me still feel like targeting really being done with the text in September seems like a very reasonable time frame to be thinking about. So that's sort of my goal. I really expect at this point that still organization may change and the writing, I hope, will get a lot better. I have technical editors coming in. You may have seen on Twitter some more people to give feedback. I'm going to have an actual editor read the book, who also happens to be my mother. Uh,
Very nice.
You know, so I'm hoping for some real improvements to the sort of readability and that sort of thing, but I don't think the content is going to change very much from here on out. So you're seeing what I think is going to be the book, but probably a little harder to read than I hope it eventually ends up.
All right.
And
Well,
not
I
getting
think
any illustration. I haven't done most of those yet.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I always love when we're going through, and either there will be like just a pencil sketch and you'll have like a caption on it of "this is awful" or things like that. So I like that you put something, or you'll just put a line describing an image that you want to be there. And there have definitely been a couple of those where I think we've discussed of, oh man, I wish, like, I want to see what's in his head, because it would definitely be helpful here.
yeah, I did a bunch of the illustrations early on, and then I like went back and I was like, wait, it's not like trying, like it was way too early. Like I kept deleting them and changing them, and it was just like, okay, I'm gonna save that for the end because I want to be pretty
totally
final.
makes sense. All right. Well, I think that's a good place for us to wrap up. So we have, let's see. So we have those final 4 chapters. We do have one interruption the second week of May, but other than that, it looks like smooth sailing. And so in theory, we will finish up towards the end of May and hopefully do one more of these.
Cool.
That last Saturday of May is what it looks like right now. So I hope that we're able to see you again, and I look forward to reading these last 4 chapters.
Yeah, John, send me, if you have a date, just send me a calendar invite. I would love to join if I can. And really thank you all. Like I know it's been just so helpful to get feedback from you all on the direction things are going, and really appreciate you all slogging through some of the early cruft here. So really appreciate you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been great to read. Go ahead.
Awesome. Thanks, folks. Have a good
All
rest
right.
of your Saturday.
Later.
All right. Bye.
Yeah.